Thanks for coming. It's great to see everyone. We have a nice full house tonight, and I'm so excited for tonight's lecture. This is the last in our series with the Eyes and Ears show, and it's been such an awesome way to reconnect with a lot of people in the design community. I've seen people coming back for multiple events, and it's really fun for our students to be able to talk with those of you who aren't our students sometimes at these events too. We're all kind of fans of the work and of the folks that have been coming in to talk, myself included, so this has been really energizing. So thank you for supporting. I want to say thanks to Danny in the tech booth, as always, who's holding us down here, and Flo, our department assistant, and Caroline and Morgan, our design work study students, who are taking pictures and checking people in tonight. They've been a big help behind the scenes with the strategy of the series too, and I hope that we can have more design shows like this in the future. And big thanks to Bijan and his team of friends and followers who have been awesome, not only about this show and curating it with us, but for supporting the education that goes along with this. And you can see we have a student show up just outside of the room tonight too, which we haven't done in a long time, and it really was a big inspiration to have Bijan and all these other folks in to talk with us this year. So big thanks to everyone. I'm Kristen Rogers-Brown, and I'm the department chair in graphic design here, also a designer outside of here. And I've been a big fan of Crystal's work, actually, for a little bit, partly because I love design and music and where they come together. To me, Crystal's work is poetic and mathy at the same time. It's very textured and lovely, but also really strong. And I'm just really inspired by not only the images, but sort of the thinking that it seems like is behind them. And I'm excited to see her talk some more. She's a graphic designer and an artist based in Chicago. I'm also from Chicago, so that's fun to see. And the round of stuff that develops and designs includes printed matter, identities, illustrations, wearables, environments, and images for cultural institutions, brands, and collaborators in fashion and music. So that's a huge range, really, for one person doing so much stuff. And I find that many of our students here and folks in our Portland community really aspire to do this kind of work. So really excited to see what you have to show us. Welcome, Crystal.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Bijan, for inviting me to speak today. I've never been to Portland before, so it means a lot to be invited to share my work. Yeah, I'm going to get started. So I'm Crystal. For the past 5 years, I've worked as an independent designer in Chicago. I work with cultural institutions, brands, and collaborators in fashion and music to develop printed matter, objects, identities, illustrations, and images. Some of my most recent projects include this watch that I designed for Glasgow-based company Pollen, and a collaboration with Adidas. I made artwork and a shirt for the original store in Chicago. And we also collaborated on a zine that features a bunch of my favorite spots and people in the city. This is a picture of my studio where I work every day, but to start, I wanted to bring it back to the beginning. When I was in middle school and high school, I spent a lot of time on MySpace and later Tumblr. It was an exciting place for me to go online and discover that there were communities of people who were interested in sharing culture. I was exposed to a lot of stuff that I otherwise didn't have access to, which had the potential to lead to deeper discovery. These are images that I found on my Tumblr from the early days of posting in 2011 and 2012. I also really loved going to the bookstore to read fashion and music magazines and discover new things through printed publications. I remember being really obsessed with Nylon magazine when I started high school in 2008. And I still have the first one that I ever bought, which happens to be the MySpace music issue. Every page has a weird shape cut out of it because I was really obsessed with making collages. I remember being on MySpace and hearing Uffy for the first time, which was when I was in middle school. I had never heard anything that sounded like it before, and it sparked a real curiosity in me. Being a young person in the aughts and 2010s meant that if you didn't go to school with anybody who liked the same music as you, you would make a MySpace page to find people that did. Magazines and the internet made the world feel smaller. My interest in the things I was seeing was really about being at the age where you begin to find yourself and also learn how to express yourself through clothing or an artistic discipline. It was really all related to learning self-expression. I also watched a lot of Style.com fashion show reviews on my iPod Classic before going to bed at night, which exposed me to new ideas about dressing and the artistic process. I began to understand inspiration in a new way and see how designers translated their interests and thoughts and emotions into an artistic output. This specific video is of Rodarte's Spring 2011 ready-to-wear collection. I really loved their interpretation of references. This show was inspired by the redwood forests and California beaches. Another one of their shows was inspired by Star Wars and X-rays. But the way that those things were translated into the clothes introduced me to new ways of thinking about making something. There's definitely a crossover with fashion design and graphic design. Both exist in the world of commerce and scale the spectrum of pragmatism, functionality, and artistic expression. The thing that I was always most excited about as a young person was my art class. Going to college, I was really passionate about keeping that momentum. This is a picture of me from that era. I went to school for graphic design, but I was interested in and excited about so many other things. My school was a very it is what you make it sort of place, but a lot of the curriculum encouraged following a path to working in advertising. During college, I had a string of internships at a nonprofit art gallery, a small PR firm, an event planning company, and an ad agency. They were all extremely important experiences that exposed me to different versions of what a career in graphic design could be. But ultimately, none of those things felt like the right fit for me personally. Graphic design is such a broad discipline, and I quickly learned about what the reality of working as one might entail. Working in these different environments helped me realize that a job at a small studio would be ideal. It's hard talking for this long because my throat gets so dry. Despite feeling a bit isolated in my BFA program, I was determined to make the most of my time at college and use the resources I had, like the screen printing studio, the wood shop, book bindery, the sewing machines, and the fabric printers. Really just trying to have some fun making work independent of the graphic design curriculum. I took furniture design, intro to sewing, printmaking 101, and bookbinding. It was a valuable time for experimentation, and I created the space for myself to investigate a trajectory that would excite me. The left photo is of me with some prints that I made during a silkscreen workshop, and the right photo is of some chairs that I made for fun during my last year of college after learning how to use power tools. I still use these skills and practical knowledge for the work that I do now. After graduating in 2016, I was really lucky to start working for Normal, a small studio in Chicago founded by Renata Grau with Alexa Vicious. Alexa left to open her own studio at the end of 2018, so the second iteration of Normal included Tim Curley. Alexa photographed us at the Barcelona Pavilion in Spain when we traveled there to see one of our clients' exhibitions. Normal works closely with a lot of other design-conscious cultural institutions, and working there I learned about the process of problem solving and a methodology for communicating ideas. Curiosity, play, and experimentation were all very integral to the design process. The approach to work was intentional, and time for exploration was prioritized. I feel really lucky to have spent 4 years at a studio that provided a space for me to learn and work closely with a team of similarly curious people. Having a good time was also really important, and we used to go on annual trips to visit with other designers and studios. It taught me the importance of work, but also the value of making time to enjoy life and find inspiration. I think this sensibility really helped lay the foundation for me to hone a practice that would later allow me to work independently. This next section is called Looking. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger writes, "We only see what we look at. To look is an act of choice. As a result of this act, what we see is brought within our reach. We never look at just one thing. We are always looking at the relation between things and ourselves. Our vision is continually active, continually moving, continually holding things in a circle around itself, constituting what is present to us as we are." One inspiration of mine is Sister Karita Kent, an artist and educator known for her bold and vibrant silkscreen compositions. This is one of my favorite works by her called Daisy. In 1947, she joined the faculty at Immaculate Heart College, where her unique methods gave students tools for new ways of seeing. I'm going to read a quote from her book, Learning by Heart. "There are only two ways of looking, slow looking and fast looking. Slow looking is best done alone. Special equipment is helpful. A magnifying glass and camera are useful tools. Charles Eames said that a camera should be as common a tool as a pencil, not just for recording, but for framing pictures and examining the details. You needn't have film in the camera for it to be a helpful implement for learning how to look and see. The lens frames a section, allowing us to put all of our attention on that special area." Another tool for looking is the finder. This is a device which does the same thing as a camera lens or viewfinder. It helps us take things out of context, allows us to see for the sake of seeing, and enhances our quick looking and decision-making skills. An instant finder is an empty 35mm slide holder, or you can make your own by cutting a rectangular hole out of a heavy piece of paper or cardboard. You can then view life without being distracted. You can make visual decisions. In fact, they're made for you. Julia Cameron writes that the quality of life is in proportion always to the capacity for delight. The capacity for delight is the gift of paying attention. And I think about this in the context of my own work, being that it is so informed by many different things, and how the attention that I pay to the world around me rewards me with the ability to approach graphic design with my own perspective and context. The finder aids in focusing in on the details of the things that we see, an opportunity to recontextualize familiar things to see them in a new way. This can provide the seed from which creativity and larger discovery can grow. One project that perfectly embodies this sensibility is the Catalog for Seeing, which was an exhibition curated by fashion designer Duro Olowu at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago that took place in early 2020. This is the last project that I worked on with Renata Graw at Normal before leaving to pursue an independent practice. The book is about the reader entering Duro's world, the art that he's seen, the culture that he's experienced, the places he's been, and how the things and people around him influence his craft as a fashion designer. A great quote by Duro is that most of the time you collect with your eyes and store everything in your brain. The book attempts to capture Duro's aesthetic and process of seeing. It includes his iPhone photos, a rich mixture of patterned textiles from his own designs, archival images from 1960s MCA openings, works that were included in the exhibition, and photos of 1970s fashion and culture in Chicago. I wanted to share this project after talking about looking and Karita Kent's finders, because I think it does a great job of showing one person's way of seeing and a cute way of processing the world. This publication makes a point to show a lot of separate influences and points of reference that contribute to and inspire a singular practice. pairing iPhone photos from everyday observations with his own textiles and famous works of art. There's no hierarchy to how the images appear, which makes it feel like all of these sources equally contribute to Duro's worldview. I really relate to this book and the idea of collecting with one's eyes. I think that my own work really ties into this same philosophy and adheres to the idea of drawing inspiration from and being influenced by a lot of different things. One source of inspiration and one foundational element of my design practice is dance, an art form that is inextricably tied to both music and visual culture. I took dance classes when I was a kid up until I was about 18 or so, and it provided me with a spatial sensibility that has really stayed with me and persisted in my work as a designer. The latest and most literal example of this being a photo illustration that I made to represent the word pose for a New York Times Word Through the Times in January of last year. But on an abstract level, I like to think that entering any space is sort of a dance by nature, and one's understanding of space determines your interactions with the environment. Choreographer Carol Brown said that dance and architecture have much in common. Both are concerned with practices of space. For a dancer, the act of choreography as a writing of place occurs through the unfolding of spatial dimensions through movement. For the architect, space is the medium through which form emerges and habitation is constructed. For both, the first experienced space is the space of the body. Choreographers have their own system for movement notation to illustrate a sequence of positions and motions. The space in which the choreography occurs becomes a blank page. A composition is built as representations of movement are added. In the medium of graphic design, a blank page is also a space. The foundation of dance is understanding how to control one's body, while the fundamentals of graphic design are concerned with the grid, proportion, and a harmonious relationship between the elements on the page. These two images represent those foundational elements of each. In both disciplines, the technical aspects are in balance with embellishment and aesthetic decisions. It's interesting to think about the strategies meant to enhance creativity that build on the technical aspects of a practice. Improvisational Technologies by William Forsythe does this exactly. It's a series of videos originally developed to train his dance company. It offers a toolkit of techniques, namely methods to explore and manipulate lines, shapes, and forms using your body as the medium and the space around your body as the composition to be filled. Some techniques being imagining lines, shearing, and extruding. These movements are informed by geometry and also mirror terms found in design vocabulary. They use traditional ballet technique as a foundation and build upon that knowledge to stimulate different thinking around the improvisation of a new movement. The description of the original CD-ROM instructional video describes these actions as a formal drawing with the body in space. The container for dance is a space, and for design, it's the page. And so dance inspires my practice both literally and metaphorically. From 2017 to 2020, I designed posters for a bi-weekly dance party in Chicago called Bricktown Sound. The exercise of reinventing the poster for the same party twice a month provided room to investigate and understand my design process. There are endless approaches to iterating on the same concept, and I think that Forsythe's methodology for reinventing a process for movement relates to the approach that I took for these posters. Each one was an opportunity to explore a new technique or concept. I used it as an outlet for experimentation. Like Forsythe's toolkit of movement concepts, I built a toolkit of different conceptual and technical approaches, which provided me with a new process and language for producing work. One being the direct reference to Forsythe by using the body as a tool, and drawing from improvisational technologies, writing in space and illustrating typography through motion. Tracing the letter S in the air and using movement as a typographic medium. I injected the action and energy of the party into the actual method for creating a visual to represent it. Here, the byproduct of movement functions as a compositional element. I also used paint to evoke the atmosphere of the party and vibrant colors to illustrate the energy. Using analog tools and working outside of the screen in a practical application like a poster opened up my understanding of using digital design tools in tandem with organic mediums. I explored alternative surfaces for presenting information. A poster isn't defined by the medium that it takes on, rather its ability to communicate. So what if the material structure of a poster contributed to its meaning? Here we have an envelope, which is typically the container for an invitation or letter. It instead functions as the primary surface for communication. How can the substrate of a poster enhance language? I also explored objects with a relationship to the setting of the party itself. A napkin like you might get with your drink at the bar. The 420 iteration of the poster was printed onto rolling paper. I always laugh at seriously presenting rolling paper at a lecture. I was designing these posters while I was still working full-time at my studio job. They gave me the space to build the foundation of my independent practice and develop my individual voice. It opened up the medium for me and created a framework for how I could think about and approach future projects. Another inspiration of mine is craft. I've always had a very hands-on approach to the things that I make and have drawn inspiration from a lot of practices that fall under the craft umbrella. I appreciate craft and folk art because the outcome is something that serves a functional purpose, but also tells a story. I think that craft is also unfortunately thought of as inferior to fine art, but I strongly disagree. It's an integral part of history, community, and femininity. Meticulous activities like sewing, quilting, and weaving have been historically undervalued and called women's work. These activities and objects possess a great amount of cultural significance and provide me with inspiration and knowledge that allow me to approach my own practice with more intention. I believe that there is an immense value in work that requires time that you can't rush. That idea is completely at odds with the demands of the contemporary design landscape and the development and normalization of AI, but nothing can really replace the humanity of somebody's hand. I found this quilting book at the thrift store near my studio in Chicago. It's a guide on how to translate symbols and images into quilting patterns. I am obsessed with quilts, and I love the idea of imbuing a functional object with meaning. A quilt uses disparate pieces of cloth, garments that are no longer wearable, old household textiles, or scraps from a sewing project, and recycles those pieces into a new role. The quilt takes on the lives of the fabric from which it's constructed. The American Peace quilt, which in the 19th century morphed into the familiar block-style quilt, was pieced block by block and then sewn together. No block was more important than any other, and all were needed to form a unified whole. That's a quote from episode 1 of Why Quilts Matter, and I just love the idea of each block is of equal importance and that each one is required in order to hold the quilt together. The Library of Congress is also an amazing reference for learning about and looking at quilts. There are a lot of photographs of ordinary people with their work, and I love that these moments have been memorialized. I especially love when the images are from communities in Chicago. This is a quilt by Mary Lee Bendolph, who is a part of the Gee's Bend collective in Alabama. Many of the quilters there are descendants of enslaved people. Her quilting fabric was made from used clothing in appreciation of the love and spirit of old cloth. This is also by a Gee's Bend quilter named Mary L. Bennett, who came from a family of quilt makers. All of the Gee's Bend quilts have a very unique look. This has the look and feel of a modernist painting. It's a beautiful object, but is also imbued with familial history, provenance, and a skill that's been passed down by generations of ancestors. I just wanted to show a few because there's truly an endless amount of quilts to look at, and sometimes I'll even go on eBay just to look at them for inspiration. These are scanned pages from the book that I found. They're patterns for letters and numbers and are almost like proto-pixel typography, creating legible characters by using a bunch of smaller shapes, each playing an important role in forming the figure. These quilting patterns reminded me of the beautiful illustrations of Susan Kerr, who designed icons for early Apple computers. Instead of each grid square representing a piece of fabric, they represent a pixel. In 2022, I was approached by Nike to redesign the basketball court of the Southside YMCA in Chicago. I was really inspired by quilting when conceptualizing the imagery for the court, and I used this idea of bringing parts together to create a collective whole as the central theme. This is a cropped scan of the number 8 from the quilting book. And I drew upon the patterns of the quilted lettering to create a typeface that used individual squares to construct each character. I thought it was a really nice metaphor for community. Here's the full set of numerals. The type itself fits into a larger idea of unifying these symbols and images. It meant a lot to me to be able to design a permanent space in Chicago where kids in the community could gather and build relationships. Each person, the kids, the instructors, the YMCA staff, are all an important piece of the community makeup. Like a quilt being passed down to different members of a family, this space will provide a use for many people for many years to come. I also designed t-shirts, the storage shed, some tote bags, heat press graphics. It was a really beautiful, inspiring project to be a part of. I found this book at the thrift store in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it's an instructional guide on how to weave baskets. I love that these activities have been a part of humanity for a long time. The knowledge on how to make something like a basket belongs to no one person, has been iterated on by generations of people and cultures, and can be practiced by anybody. There's also a beautiful sense of community in these images. I think the time spent performing the repetitive motion of weaving is an integral part of the activity. Taking the time to make objects that enhance one's life is an inspiring approach to creating. This is one of my favorite images that I've ever made, which accompanied an interview for SSENSE with Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, author of the book, The Undocumented Americans. She speaks about the experiences of undocumented individuals working in America. I made a paper weaving to represent the many narratives that have built a more holistic document of, as the New York Times put, stories that are largely absent from modern journalism and literature. She weaves these accounts of undocumented life into the fabric of history. Here's a photo of the actual paper weaving, which is a great example of the inspiration that a craft like basket weaving provides. I think that there's great value in learning the discipline and patience required to make something by hand. In an article about the work of architect George Nakashima, author Michael Snyder wrote that ultimately the work of craft is the work of looking, a last bulwark against carelessness. This quote feels more relevant than ever, with AI posing a threat to artists and the simple human need to make things. This project draws on craft, but was also for a craft school. It was cool to work on a project for a discipline that inspires me so much. I was asked to create the logo for the School of Many Questions, which is a studio and craft school. They host workshops on things like candlestick making and caning. The logo represents the foundational building blocks that open up a path of inquiry. The question mark is the path itself, acting as one holistic form or two separate parts, both representing growth and process. I love this project not only because I feel connected to it conceptually, but it was really made for my friends. The images on the left and right are from a chair building workshop hosted at my friend and neighbor Mary Eleanor's space called Tusk. And it's really special to feel connected to the work on this level, collaborating with friends and also being able to draw from the deep inspiration that craft provides. More than a craft-inspired approach being aesthetically driven, it's just my process and way of understanding how to make something. Printing things is an important step for me. Touching and moving each element opens up my way of seeing and breaks the barrier of it being confined to the screen. I think about my approach to graphic design as craft. Most of my work has some element of looseness. I really love drawing. I think it's fun to create contrast between our intensely digital world and the texture of something handmade. It provides warmth. It elevates imperfection, grit, organic energy, and ultimately feels like a rewarding way of making things. Next section is music. As a kid, I remember buying and coveting a book about the 100 most popular albums of the 1970s. It included an image of each album, and this is the artwork of the top-selling album of the decade. Despite being an extremely simple image, the most minimal in the entire book, it represents music that made a seismic cultural impact and sold 23 million copies. I love album artwork because it's totally subjective and doesn't necessarily require a grand production to be super iconic. These are some albums that were heavily influential for me as a teenager. My professional trajectory was heavily influenced by music. It's always felt like my main point of access to culture. Growing up in the suburbs and digging into MySpace and Tumblr to find out about new music and shows, taking the train to go see my favorite bands with friends, it provided me with a sense of freedom and made it feel like I was a part of something. These photographs are from a show that I went to in 2012. Music has connected me to a lot of people in my community in Chicago. Early in my freelance days, I worked on design for a lot of friends' music projects as a result of making posters for Bricktown Sound, and by simply going out and being present at shows. It's how I started to build community for myself and find collaborators to work with. Often music imagery is totally subjective and open-ended, so it creates an opportunity to try new things. Collaborating with musicians is a beautiful way to form a symbiotic relationship with another artist. Posters I've made for musicians are some of my favorite pieces of work. Each one is an opportunity to experiment. These singular explorations can lead to further studies and methods of image making and can provide the foundation for larger projects that nurture the seed of a specific moment. My most significant and ongoing collaboration is with my partner, Will. Shout out Will, who's present here in the audience, whose project is called Reservoir. He is similarly interested in the slow process of layering analog and digital, but sonically instead of materially. These are some photos that I took of him recording the sounds of Vancouver Island. Working together has been a rich exercise in exploring the visual world of music. So emotional resonance is such an important aspect of music, and I think it makes it one of the most powerful and unifying forms of art. This was a video that I made for one of his songs in April of 2020 called Life Before. This is the artwork for the flexi disc release of the song, which speaks to the days of the early pandemic, longing for connection and community in a time of intense isolation. Being steeped in nostalgia and ruminating on the past and the ways in which the world was rapidly changing. Visually representing the spirit of music with an image is a great challenge, but it can be some of the most rewarding work. Trying to honor someone else's creativity in a non-visual medium is really difficult. Will and I work very collaboratively. There isn't a team, it's just us. So it's interesting to not only be responsible with defining the visual world in terms of the graphic direction, but with Reservoir, I'm also creating images. The artwork for Escalator, a single by Reservoir, draws from the energetic and free instrumentals of the song. The work I make for musicians is impressionistic and based on both feeling and observation. The design process becomes an intuitive exercise of listening. Will and I have been a lot of places together, and ultimately all of those experiences contribute to our creative partnership. These photos were taken on a trip to LA, which served as layers in building the world of his second record. Will had the idea to create an image of the time of day known as blue hour, which is when the sun dips below the horizon and the sky is still illuminated. This atmosphere was carried out throughout the release. I still wanted motion in the outdoors to be present even when there wasn't imagery, so I created a series of ink and pen drawings that act as accents on the interior record sleeve, almost like the flight path of a bird. The single artworks were of the same world, fuzzy, hazy outdoor scenes resulting in abstractions. This one was particularly really fun. We were staying in Woodstock, New York for a few days in spring of 2023. We were deep in the world of mountains and grass and saunaing when we saw some caterpillars suspended on the edge of an eaten leaf in the field next to where we were staying. We took a lot of videos of them, and it inspired the artwork for the first single release on the album called Inside Minds. Some of my favorite work resulted from the Reservoir world translated to posters for the orchestra rendition of the band. Will put a group of 16 musicians together to play a show in Chicago, and I wanted the tone of the world and nature to still feel present, but with a slightly different vibe since the only visual elements are typographic. I wanted to merge the worlds of Reservoir and traditional orchestra design language. I love the idea of celebrating each player and including the names of every musician who was a part of the performance. It felt like a really true celebration of community. And some closing thoughts. What's going on with my career? I think a lot about sustainability in terms of my career and lifestyle. How do I find balance as an independent practitioner? And how can I maintain it? Spiritually, financially, and creatively. Ideally, I'm working on projects that inspire me, but sometimes caring about something can mean that it might be spiritually fulfilling, but maybe it doesn't pay much. The perfect job is one where I'm excited about the work, the client is easy to communicate with, and I'm being fairly compensated. But to be honest, that's very rare, and finding balance is so important and is one of the biggest ongoing challenges. I think at the end of the day, graphic design is for a client, which dictates what actually sees the light of day. I put a lot of energy into things that are ultimately unused and unseen, and it can be discouraging when your work is rejected. But I also think about how making accessible imagery is the business of graphic design. Because of this, as designers, we can be tempted to indulge in the impulse of making something that fits into the canon of existing trends or acceptable imagery. The internet can promote homogeneity as a result of mood boarding and algorithms, which removes work from its original context and makes it consumable on a purely aesthetic level. In other words, sometimes we're encouraged to make work that looks like something that already exists. Risk-taking is not necessarily the incentive when there's a financial aspect at play, and when there are metrics that show what kind of imagery is palatable to consumers, creativity can suffer as a result. There's a fatigue that can result from operating in this system, but ultimately it serves as encouragement and motivation to have a dedicated creative practice outside of work. For example, I made a run of a few hand-painted shirts. One shirt took an entire day to make, and I tried to figure out how a faster process for making them, and there wasn't one, which was not practical at all, but I asked my friend and old coworker, Alexa, to film them. I hired 2 tap dancers to wear them, and designed film titles, woven labels, and made a bunch of images. Not because I wanted to sell them, but truly just for fun and because I wanted to. Making things just because you want to is important and meaningful. And after doing this project, I felt so much closer to the truth of why trusting in my creativity is so important, because it has the ability to simply make me happy. It's so easy to lose sight of that in the shuffle of everything else. Another passion project of mine has been building out a tea lounge in my studio. I built this table and these stools with the guidance of my friend Leslie, whose craft school I talked about earlier. It's an area for me to rest. It's a space for me to read a book or simply lie down. Existing in this discipline can be a challenge. Some days when I'm lacking clarity, it's helpful to look to others for inspiration. I like to watch other lectures in preparation for giving a talk, and one that I love to come back to is Virgil Abloh's Harvard lecture. One of his ideas that I wanted to share is to have mentors, dead or alive. He suggests that thinking of someone you admire whose knowledge is still accessible as a mentor, to use the career of someone whose work you like and dig deeper into their motivations, their teachings, opinions, insights, and potentially using what you learn as a foundation for your own practice. Karita Kent had a really great way of framing her work and approach as a tool for others to use. These rules provide a supportive framework to guide and inspire one's thinking. For me, her teachings are good reminders that there's more than one way of doing things, and to value my creativity irrespective of its utility and value to clients. I think the key to staying engaged and inspired is just keeping your eyes open, reflecting, digging deeper into the things that provide you with joy, and resting when needed. Doing these things can produce a unique approach to your own individual practice. To close this out, I just want to encourage slowing down and allowing yourself the time to look, listen, reflect, and find inspiration. The things that inspire me are what give my work meaning. Thank you. And thanks for sticking with me because public speaking is hard, y'all.
I'm going to grab a mic and walk around. If there are questions, you can just kind of wave me down. I'll keep an eye out.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It was really nice. A lot of nice work in there. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you like to collaborate with musicians and like what your process is. Like, do some people have a lot of experience with graphic design already and you work together on them, or are you like, hey, make me a mood board? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I feel like I work with people who have varying degrees of working with a graphic designer. Will and I obviously have like a specific way of working together since we live together and it's just like it becomes all encompassing where we're like constantly talking about it. But I actually really like to work with people who I feel like we share like a common interest, or there's like some sort of through line where maybe we appreciate some of the same things, or they have like a point of reference for visual language. Like one other musician who I work with a lot is Helado Negro, who actually has a background as a visual artist. So I think I like connect with people who have like some point of reference for that, and because of the mutual appreciation for things, like it makes it easier to communicate and there's like a trust involved. And I think those are just the people who I gravitate towards working with. And sometimes, you know, it can be hard to establish a relationship, but the two strong ones that I have are like people who I think understand the language, but it really differs between each person. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any strategy when you feel stuck or blocked, or I'm just curious, I guess, your process when you're feeling blocked, or if you feel blocked.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I feel like we've all been there where we feel blocked, and I don't know. I think I have like a lot of art books and like architecture books and things to look at when I'm feeling stuck. I think it's really helpful to like look at other people's perspectives and look at, you know, things that you admire that are just like there to learn from. I guess I don't have like one specific thing that I like to do, but if I'm feeling stuck, sometimes it means that I like need to take a walk or take a break and just like remove myself from the work, because I think, yeah, we've all been there and it's hard. And I feel like every time maybe the being stuck is like coming from a different place, but ultimately it's like maybe I need to take some space from what I'm looking at. It's not concrete advice, but yeah.
I'm going to build on that question a little
Yeah.
bit, because I think there are so many ideas in your presentation for like ways that you can slow down so that you aren't stuck anymore. You're just going a little slower.
Mm-hmm.
How do you push this slowness for, I mean, I'm sure it's not that slow really when you have clients, but how do you sort of fold that into your work when there may not always be time for it? Like, how do you make time for that?
It's really hard. I mean, I feel like right now I'm actually coming off of like a very busy period, and it's just so happens to coincide with this talk. And because I'm traveling to speak to you all right now, I'm taking advantage of being in Portland, and I'm like taking a few days to myself to just be in nature and like take a break. And I think that the time doesn't always present itself, but like when there is an opportunity, I try to be really intentional about it.
That's really smart, I think. It's like you're traveling for work, but then you're not.
Yeah, for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
That was excellent talk, and really thank you for that dose of nostalgia and connection back to MySpace and Tumblr, because that is a huge influence to us who grew up in that time. I had a question about, like, I was thinking about Arena, and I was thinking about social media and how much your process, your references, your work has really kind of defined like sort of a visual language you see on those platforms. And I was kind of feeling like that is the antithesis of what you're describing in your process of drawing from so many outside references and slowing down and getting offline. So my question would be, how are you balancing that? What's your outlook on it? Are you embracing it, rejecting it? How do you like avoid that design vacuum that happens online?
I think it's really hard. I mean, I definitely am not immune to it. Like, I live in 2025 as a graphic designer too, and like ultimately clients, these are the tools that clients use. So I am definitely on those channels as well. But I think in being on those channels, if I see something that's interesting to me, I don't want to just take it at face value, and like I want to learn about who made it or where it came from or like what the context is, because I think the hard thing about seeing imagery on channels like that is that it's removed from the context of why it exists and who made it. And as someone who makes things, like there is a lot of thought that goes into it, and I want to be able to connect with that too. So I think that, you know, despite the actual resources being like, yeah, devoid of context, like it does make it easy to dig deeper into why it exists in the first place. So I guess that's my answer. Like I try to dig a little bit deeper even when I, yeah, am on those websites.
Got one in the front of the room here. I'm speedy, but not that speedy.
Hi. My question is, you have a lot of physical like references to your work, and it's beautiful, and I love that. But is it hard to find clients that want that type of piece from you because of how you're talking about social media now, and it's easy for them to look for references themselves? And how do you keep them from pushing like those, I guess, like mainstream design aspects that are like kind of trending now? How do you keep true to yourself?
That's a good question. I guess like talking about the Bricktown Sound posters, like that era of my career was like a really formative time for me, and just trying to establish like what my visual language was, and that sort of like, I don't know, provided this image for people to respond to. And I think that oftentimes clients contact me because they want something that feels like a little bit more tactile or gritty. And I feel lucky for that reason, where if someone's, you know, asking me to work on something, hopefully part of the reason is because they enjoy that aspect of my work. But yeah, it can be hard, but I think the projects that I enjoy the most and the projects that I want to work on are like the ones where people are coming to me because they like the messiness a little bit.
Got one back here, then one over here.
Hello. Do you feel like you immediately go to like using your hands, or do you tend to like immediately go digitally when you're starting a project or like a client comes to you?
I definitely start on the computer and then like usually print a bunch of stuff out and like scan it back in or print it out and do something to it. But yeah, I think I do start digitally, and then like the rest kind of follows. Yeah.
For sure. And then one more, sorry.
No. Go ahead.
When like working with a client and things are just like not going a certain way, or like how hard do you feel like you push for your ideas, or like it gets to a point where maybe they have a vision and you're kind of just providing them with that?
The latter happens like a lot, and ideally that's like not the way that a project goes, but sometimes it does. That's just the reality. Yeah.
Sweet.
And you know, I think it depends on the context of like when I push back. I think if I'm working with like an individual, it's a lot easier, but if someone like a big company is hiring me, like I don't really have a lot of say, I guess.
Thanks.
Which can be hard.
Yeah.
One in the front, and then I'll come to the back over here again.
Hi, I'm Kennedy. Your presentation was amazing. But yeah, my question was, how do you go about convincing people who might not have design knowledge or more on the business side about like a direction you want to go with, or like a product you made. I feel like it's hard to like convince someone, and almost feels like storytelling. But yeah, I'd want to know what your approach is like, and if they reject that, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I think it differs with everybody, but I don't know. That's a tough question, because being a graphic designer, like, you do have to be open to other opinions. So I think communicating my ideas, like, really happens on like the smaller level projects where I'm, working with one person, or working on a music project where I'm like in direct contact with the artist. It's like a lot easier to bounce ideas off of each other and communicate. But I feel like the range of clients that I work with is like that sort of thing, ranging up to like working with an agency where I'm working with a big team of people, and like I don't have a lot of say in those situations, which can be hard. But I think communicating ideas, typically like where I feel safest is with people there is like mutual trust already. But it's hard to figure out, because there's such a range of like going back and forth between, maybe you're working with like your friend one day, and then maybe you have to be communicating with like the marketing or the HR department of like a big company the next. And it's like hard to sort of like figure out what is appropriate, even like, do I have a say here, or am I just supposed to like go along with what's going on? So yeah, it's challenging, but I guess it just comes from experience. It's the long answer.
Actually, I think we have one more in the middle here. Did somebody else have a question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mara. I loved your talk. It was great. Thank you so much.
You.
Kind of piggybacking off of their question, I was curious about what it's like when you're kind of interfacing with these bigger companies like Adidas or A24. Like, are you presenting your ideas in a presentation deck and kind of explaining your stuff that way? Are you talking to like a middle person? Do you show these things to like a team? I'm just really curious how that looks.
Yeah, it's always different. Like with the Adidas project that I just did, I was working with a marketing agency, and they were sort of like, or we were working together on like concepts of what kind of like, what is it that we're working on? And we ended up working on this zine that we made together that featured like local businesses. But at the beginning, like that wasn't the idea. And I sort of pushed back and told them like, oh, I think, why don't we rethink this? And they were very receptive to it. And that's like an ideal situation where someone is like hearing my opinion. With, presenting work, like oftentimes with A24, for example, like I was working with one person and he was just sort of like, yeah, go crazy, like make a bunch of A24s. And I like handed them off, and then they made like really cool objects with them, and I wasn't a part of that. And so it just like it is different with everybody, which can be hard because you don't really know, like it's not a consistent thing necessarily.
I've got one from the live stream back here that I think is really good. So from the interwebs, your work is so beautifully documented, kind of to a degree beyond just capturing the work. It feels really designed. And so they're wondering where that sort of documentation approach kind of, like, how did you develop that approach? Where did it stem from? And sort of like, what value have you really found in having that? Or do you know that you have it?
Well, thank you to that person for being so nice and complimenting the way that I document work. But honestly, it just comes from a place of like enjoying it.
Yeah.
Like if I get a t-shirt, like I've designed a lot of shirts, right? Graphic design, designed a bunch of shirts. I don't want to just like mock up the t-shirt every time, because to me, like, sure, you can see the design, but in reality, like I live with these shirts, they are objects, and I want to capture them like in my environment or in like a way that feels fresh to me, or it's also like a fun way to like not be on the computer, be out in the world photographing things, or like conceptualizing something that uses like a different part of my brain than working on a, you know, client project. So I think it just comes from like a desire to make images, which is something that I really enjoy doing.
Yeah, it does feel like a really, like the completion of your inspiration all the way through. And you talk about mentorship and physical making and all of that. It does feel like the extension of that. So I think that's really interesting too.
One more question. Kind of still thinking about outside references and just like eclectic interests, kind of building landscape for the work. Have you ever had a time where maybe an outside interest kind of shadowed, I don't know, did design ever take a back seat, or you felt less inclined to, at least like in a digital sense, make and wanted to kind of like pursue those other interests?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Every day. Yeah. Like my brain is, you know, I work on all these projects, but like my brain is always going, and it's like full of crazy ideas of like, what if I did this? Like, I don't know. I'm definitely like consumed by that too, and hope to, strike a balance where like that's, you know, taking up part of my week as well, and not just like a mental thing that I entertain.
I'm thinking about some of the questions that we've talked about in our thesis development class and in our portfolio development classes. So I'm going to channel some of that energy here. What kinds of things make you feel like really stuck in the work? Like, have you run into any roadblocks that you've made it through?
That's a good question. Let me think. I mean, feeling stuck. I don't know. I think sometimes like the deadline is really helpful. Like having a deadline is so critical, because if you're stuck, like you have to push through it. Like there's just, I don't know. And every single time, like maybe it looks different, but I don't have like a clean piece of advice to give on how to unstuck yourself. It's like something that happens to me all the time, and maybe it's just like, a period of the week where I'm like, I'm not feeling it. But ultimately, like, I find inspiration at some point. But I don't know. It's just something you got to work through. It's something you have to feel sometimes, something you have to sit with. I don't know.
I think that's why I asked the question. I think sometimes it's nice for us to hear that other folks who seem really productive also feel that.
Totally.
So I know there's not like an easy answer, so that's a hard question. But any others? We probably have time for one or two more. I'm just going to pass down.
Hi. Thank you so much. Great talk. I'm a huge fan. You've made so many objects specifically. Do you have like a dream object that you want to create? Graphic design or not?
Great question. This is gonna sound crazy, but I really, I would love to design an egg slicer. I don't know. I don't know. It's an object that I've like always really liked, and I feel like it feels more in line with like, you know, if you're an industrial designer, like something that an industrial designer would know how to make. But I really love objects, and it's fun to design them. But an egg slicer, it's like pretty simple, but I don't know. It's just like always in the back of my head, like, what if I designed that? That'd be cool.
That would be cool.
I love that you had that answer kind of ready. You were like, it's
always
definitely
been
an
a
egg
thing.
slicer.
Yeah, I've always wanted to. I don't know why.
Okay, I'm not a designer or anything, but I just have a question. How do you, okay, don't judge me on if this makes sense, but how do you keep yourself in check to like avoid gentrifying your work? I don't know if that makes sense, but like making it not feel authentic to who you are.
It's hard sometimes. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's tough because the style that I work in is like was very much developed like when I was working on the Bricktown Sound posters that I showed earlier, and like that's a very sort of like grassroots community event that is, you know, local to Chicago. I would go to myself, like I'd see a bunch of people I knew there and felt like very, you know, local and community driven. And I think something I grapple with is like, am I like, what is the ethical question when it comes to using that aesthetic that I developed for the community on these larger projects for corporations? Like, is that weird? Is that something that I need to like interrogate in myself? But I guess, yeah, I don't know. It's definitely a question that I ask. But ultimately I think it's like cool that these companies like value the work that I do, I guess. But the flip side of that is like, yeah, sometimes they're asking for something specific and maybe that doesn't feel authentic to me. But as a graphic designer, again, it's like you are working with a client and it's hard to balance the like what you want and what they want. So yeah, it can be tough.
Do you feel at odds with that tension, or do you feel like that's kind of like a thing like deadlines that kind of like they push you along, you know? Is it a bit of both?
Yeah, for sure. A bit of both. I think it's like good to ask questions to yourself and like, yeah, but ultimately like gotta keep going and it feels good to make work. So yeah.
Any last questions? We'll take one more here.
Thank you. A lot of your work is analog. Do you ever run into problems with clients asking you for like layered files or anything, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to like translate the way that I practically build my work to like sharing it with people. Like the other day I was like screen sharing my like art boards and was super self-conscious because I was like, this looks insane. And then at the end of the day, they're like, can you send us your files? And I was like, I need to like clean this up. And then my computer like stopped and was like, I hate what's going on, because there are like a million different like high-res scans being like clip masked, and it was just like a mess. And so yeah, sometimes I do struggle with like the practicality of like transferring a file to somebody, because the way I work like in 2025 is like I'm putting a bunch of images in an Illustrator file versus just like the simple way. So yeah, it can be a bit messy sometimes.
I have one more question from online, and it's a big one, so you don't have to have an answer to this. But I'm curious, like, do you think that designers starting out should be worried about AI? Or do you have a philosophy or a worry, or kind of like, well, it's good for this, it's bad for this, you know? What are your thoughts right now? I realize we're all just forming opinions of this too.
Yeah, totally. I'm definitely a little afraid of it, a bit skeptical of it. Should we be worried about it? Well, I don't know I feel like when you're working with somebody, they don't necessarily know what they want. And
right.
in order to produce something using AI, you have to know what you want. And like being a graphic designer is very much like processing what the client is asking of you, which like isn't an ability of AI. Like you have to have a person to do that. So right now I'm like, I don't know, I'm not that worried.
Yeah, I feel like
scary.
You have to be a little bit of a sociologist, right?
Mm-hmm,
That's like
totally
a huge part of, seems like, your process too.
For sure.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.